Hi, it's Rob Herman, and welcome to the Super Performers Podcast powered by 4100 FS. As we worked on developing this podcast, our overriding goal was to create a compelling platform for accessible insights on work and life from successful, driven, and highly accomplished leaders. Leaders with unique experiences across a wide variety of fields, including business, medicine, law, sports, entertainment, education, and philanthropy, among others. In my head, I started to work through a fascinating group I wanted as guests, and I got pretty excited. I've gotten to know these people through my own varied experiences early in my career on Capitol Hill, later working on Wall Street and as an investment manager, being an entrepreneur, and now leading a unique and thriving company called 4100 FS while also focusing on community engagement. I think you'll really enjoy hearing the stories of these guests, learning about their respective paths, finding out what motivates them and how they define success. Glad to have you with us on the Super Performers Podcast. Without further ado, on to our guest today. Our guest today on the Super Performers Podcast is Moira Weir. Moira is an innovator and a change agent, creating positive impact in our community and through her example, other communities as well. She's the president and CEO of United Way of Greater Cincinnati. She became the first female president and CEO of United Way in March 2020. She's guided the organization through transformative change designed to help all people achieve economic well-being within a 9-county service area in Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana. Before joining United Way, Moira was the director of Hamilton County Job and Family Services for 12 years. She started as a children's services line worker for the agency and held various leadership positions before being named director. For frame of reference, Hamilton County Job and Family Services has 800 employees, a $2.5 billion annual budget, and serves 500,000 residents annually. Her vision for United Way centers on its role as a community catalyst, uniquely positioned to drive change through investments, influence, and filling gaps in service. She's led efforts to bring new voices and solutions to decades-old community challenges. In 2020, national philanthropist MacKenzie Scott chose to invest in Moira's leadership, presenting United Way of Greater Cincinnati with a $25 million grant. Moira, it's great to have you on the Super Performers Podcast. Thanks so much for taking the time. Great to have you here. We have a long friendship and history together, so it's a pleasure to dig in and learn some more about you.
Well, thank you for having me. I feel honored that you asked.
Absolutely. You truly are a super performer in so many ways. But let's start. I want to talk. I've had the benefit of being a friend of yours for a long time, so I know a little bit about your family background. I've heard some stories about your dad. Tell me a little bit about Philadelphia and maybe just a sense of your family life growing up, because I think it's integral to who you are.
Yeah, no, sure. So my parents immigrated to the United States, and my brother was born in Scotland. I was born here, but we went back and forth. And ultimately, my parents came to this country for education. They felt like they wanted their children to have a public school education because that was far better than what they would have been able to have in Scotland. They were very poor. And when they came here, they were committed to making sure that all three of their children were educated and that also had the opportunity to go to college. So that was a big value in our family, so to speak. As well as we were, since we were poor actually, but my parents were working hard, we were able to eat. So we had what we needed as far as I knew. and, but we also had one thing I would say about my parents that I'm really grateful for. They were really committed to community, and they felt like no matter what we had, we would always give whatever we had to those who didn't have it. So I feel like that was the beginning of my understanding about how you share and how you have this shared really ownership and leaning into each other. We had very much a community. We lived in what I would call an under-resourced neighborhood, but we all pitched in and helped out. And my parents worked evenings and through the night, and my neighbors would watch us. So I say that to say I felt early on in my life I had this, I was taught the importance of really helping others. Community is really important, and like collectively what we can do. Ultimately, we ended up in Philadelphia. I went to public schools my whole life. I graduated, and all three of us kids went to college. And we actually all three were lucky to go to graduate school. So that was, my parents felt like a huge accomplishment that we were able to do that. My dad always said that an education is something that is yours forever. Nobody can take that away from you. And from their minds, that was really how you lift yourself out and hopefully out of poverty and have access to opportunities. recognizing that we were white. I mean, that was something that I learned very early on because we actually lived in a very diverse neighborhood and we were in the projects. And so learned early on that the color of my skin gave me privileges that didn't give always my neighbors. So anyway, here I am in Philadelphia. I'm working for a real estate developer and was felt like I wanted to do something for community. And I ended up being a mentor to a foster child. And as you know, you've heard me tell the story 100 times that it changed my life because being with her, knowing her, loving her, but also seeing the challenges that she had were heartbreaking. And I found myself often really frustrated trying to advocate for her. Often she was the only person of color in the room. People were making decisions about her and her family that sometimes just didn't seem fair and right. And I even felt like I didn't have a voice. And I know she didn't feel that way. So through all this, I was talking to my mother about it. And my mom said, well, if you really care, do something about it. Don't just talk about it. I was like, what do you mean? She's like, get involved, do something around policy. So I ultimately ended up, I had to keep my job working because I couldn't afford to go back to school and not work. So I worked full time, went back to school to get my master's in social work, and then quit that job to become a child welfare worker, which I think at first gave my parents a heart attack. Because they were like, well, are you going to support yourself? Um, but it was the best decision I made. And ultimately that led to me coming to Cincinnati. I was a worker in public sector work, meaning, working with families, accessing public support benefits, food stamps, cash, Medicaid, also child welfare. And then also we became the director of what's known as the Job and Family Services here locally. And we had a budget of $2.4 billion. We served 1 in 3 people in our region. And those families were all families that were living below the poverty level in our region. So it was great. I loved it. And it was the best experience. Really, I felt like it's been a journey. And how I end up where I am now is just part of that journey.
Yeah, that's great. I love the overview, and I want to dig into job and family services, which is where we got to know each other, working on something called Family Fund related to foster youth, and really bonded. And I learned a lot from you. I want to back up for a second because I got the sense from hearing you talk about both your parents, but I heard more about your dad, that value of education, his work ethic, and my understanding was, I mean, up until his 80s and maybe even to his 90s, he was still doing a lot of active things. Tell me just a bit more about your dad because I really enjoyed hearing about him.
Yeah, and so I say that my parents were both hard workers. I mean, it was just now my mom, I think part of it because of at the times, she never went to college because, you know, one of them had to go to college and they chose to have my father go to college. And so she worked 2 or 3 jobs and took care of so they had very traditional roles sometimes, but then in the beginning they were, both working hard. But I say that to say, because my mom, I think the times kept her from doing probably things that she wanted to do, but she loved her family. I don't mean
Right.
that. But my father, my
Yeah.
parents were really strong believers in if you have to work hard, you have to be committed, you have to show up. My dad's always like, get to work earlier than you're supposed to be there, get prepared, if you have something like the first few times I started having meetings, he's like, make sure you have an agenda, make sure you're prepared. I mean, he really instilled in us to show up as your best all the time. And that, my parents were always fearful until they became citizens that, if we sidestep, we wouldn't be allowed to stay. And so it was really important for them that we show up extra special all the time. And we're always on our best behavior. I mean, my mom's always like, don't get in trouble at school. Don't talk back to the teachers, So, but no, they just really instilled a strong work ethic and how important it was. And, we all had to work. We had, chores growing up. We were expected to have jobs and, go to school. So it was never like, um, there was a lot of expectations on working hard. And my mom had a lot about gratitude, how lucky we were. So I feel like that's something that was instilled. But yes, to answer your question, my father worked up until he was 89. And only then really retired more because he was wanted to spend, my mom's health was declining. So he wanted to spend some more time with my mom.
Yeah. I love that. And, I think about, and it's one of the things that we've talked about in the past, that the types of things that your parents both stood for and work ethic, follow through, We talk about that when we get together about how important that is to have a team around you that really takes that seriously, and it's so important to achieve your goals and more broadly the goals of an organization. So I think you did your parents proud. 3 degrees. You ended up getting an MBA later. What point? So you got your master's in social work. You talked a little bit about getting involved in the community, took an interest in social work, and we'll come back to job and family services in a second. At what point did you decide to get an MBA?
So, I my undergraduate was in finance, and so I really saw myself, before I had this wonderful experience with Cleo, my foster the foster child. I really saw myself in a business environment, and I don't know where that came from. But then I thought, well, I ended up being in a space I love, but I also thought we need to run it like a business, or we need to think of it as a business only because like we have the opportunity to do something that we like in my heart I believe strongly in. But I have to be able to be accountable. I have to be able to show, whether it's public dollars or donor dollars, that we have outcomes and that we are being fiscally responsible and that we have budgets and that we live by them. Because I think, I would hear sometimes that people felt like people in the government or nonprofit sector didn't know how to run a business. And I quite frankly would argue that, because it's actually very complex, and a lot of the problems I have are the same problems my colleagues are when I'm in a business roundtable. It's people, it's process, it's
Yeah.
the things, the tactical things. And I would say our budgets are very, I mean, gosh, coming from government, the different funding streams and the accountability, it's complex. So I really thought that having an MBA would help me be a better leader and be a better and therefore be better for community, because it was really about how best to maximize the dollars that we had to service those that we are here to serve. And that's always been a driver for me, is the more we can give back and put back into community, the better community is, as long and make sure it's meeting the needs. We have accountability built into it, but it certainly is meeting the need, not something that we think is meeting the need, but we have data that says it is doing something.
Yeah, well said. And it's interesting. You talked a little about the evolution of your mindset. I take it when you came out of school, undergrad, and you worked for a large real estate company for several years, for 5 years, that maybe your mindset coming out of school, as you mentioned, changed significantly when you had that community experience and you were looking for something different. But how did you end up? You were living on the East Coast in the Philadelphia area. What was Cincinnati? Was it an opportunity to work? Because you came in as a frontline caseworker. What was it about Cincinnati, or was it just the opportunity? Were you looking to change geography? All of the above.
So I wasn't looking to change geography. It was actually, it was a good opportunity. I was really interested in specifically, I felt that families should not be subjected to any public sector system because they're poor unless they want to. And that's, to me, was like, so for instance, a lot of families that ended up in the child welfare system, and unfortunately that still do, sometimes just need access to services or resources. But unfortunately, because they don't know how to get them, they might have to they get pulled in through the child welfare system. So there was a project that I was really interested in about how do you um, the correlation between poverty and child welfare, but how do you make sure that children aren't coming into the system because of that? So that's what brought me here. I was working on it was like just I thought a 2 year a 2 year job, and then ended up really loving the work and loving the community and the people, and I then was getting I got promoted, and I really kept thinking that I would go back east, and then ultimately I ended up, getting married, having a family. So then that's, your roots start to take to take in. But I do think I will say this, that the Cincinnati region is a very generous, philanthropic region, very caring. And I really found that actually some of the policy work we did was easier to do in a way than it was on the East Coast, in sense that there wasn't so much sometimes the bureaucracy. There's still bureaucracy. I don't want to suggest that there's not, but I felt like it was easier to navigate some of the services and the sectors.
Yeah, it's kind of a fascinating evolution because when we talk about United Way of Greater Cincinnati, the work you're doing to fight poverty, is when you talked about what you were doing early on in your career, job and family services. I see a relationship there and how your career's progressed, which is really interesting. And we'll talk about the great and really groundbreaking work that United Way Greater Cincinnati is doing. But it's interesting. I'd be curious to hear. I counted 7 different roles that you had at Job and Family Services as you became the director. And again, for context, you mentioned this before, but a $2.5 billion budget, 800 or thereabouts employees, serving around 50,000 people annually. It's a massive operation. So I want to start with just what it because you talked about the project you worked on initially, but what was it like, when you stepped in as a caseworker, quite a bit different than being the VP of a large real estate company. What was that first couple of months, that transition like? You're in a new city, you're working in direct service and in a very different environment. What was that first couple of months like? How difficult was it? And I know the work was gratifying, but it must have been quite an adjustment.
I mean, yes, I went from being a salaried employee to an hourly employee. I went from, I was on um, a management track. Like, if I stayed in this role, there was a career path laid out for me when I was hired on. Like, this is where you could end up being in 5 years, 10. So I went from a lot of flexibility as a salaried employee, working really hard, to becoming an hourly employee where there was a lot of oversight, which is good because, you're out in, community. But also, I had my first interaction with unions because we had multiple unions in our organization. A lot of the child welfare staff were not unionized, but we were interacting with other union staff. So that was very different for me. I hadn't experienced that before. And, I had the mentality from my family that you just keep, working. I have a distinct memory of my supervisor coming to me and telling me, because I would work through lunch a lot because I couldn't keep up with the paperwork and stuff like that. And basically said, you must take a 45-minute break for lunch. And I was like, but I have all this work and it doesn't matter. You have to do that. That is a requirement. So, I mean, those were the really
Right.
interesting nuances that I just had to adjust to, that seemed so odd because I had work to do and I just couldn't imagine like not doing the work. So I almost found myself,
Right.
doing stuff at night at home because I didn't know when else to keep it up. But that was my choice. I mean, that was totally my choice because I kept thinking about like these families, like, how am I going to do my job? So it was a big, huge shift. And then really just, the not knowing initially how funding in public sector work is so allocation, like they're so specific. So this task, you have to check this, there's ways you allocate your time to so they could get reimbursed for the funds, was just very different. So I would say it was a shock to the system at first. Um, I never questioned the change, but I sometimes wondered how would I be able to make it in that kind of like very structured environment at first. At first it felt very confining. And over time, obviously, as people get to know you and you move up in the organization and things became a little bit more fluid. But it was a shock to the system. I will say that.
Yeah. You were on a management track, and I know that there was thought about how you would evolve in different roles and things like that. But did you kind of come into it saying, I mean, everybody wants to make an impact. Did you see yourself as being, kind of maybe not director? I know that's, from the starting point, a little hard to envision from day one. But did you see yourself did you have a vision of what you wanted to accomplish more broadly in such a large organization like that, agency like that?
I wish I could say that, but no. I always say to people, my journey was very it was not a straight line. And
Sure.
I just saw myself. I mean, I think my biggest aspiration was, being able to be a manager over workers, because I thought, wow, I could really impact like that. Like if I had that segment of folks, like what could we do collectively? So I think in time though, when I was a worker for a long time, then became a manager, as you referenced. And then I had the opportunity to move into other parts of the organization. And I asked for that. And people were like, why would you do that? Because it was like I actually went to a harder place, but I was like, I wanted to learn and understand. I'm sort of a tactical person. I like to see how operations work and then what are the connections and what's the connection with that public sector application and this, I wanted to see how they all come together. So, um, and then in time, I started to say, oh, I started having more. When I went to get my MBA, I will tell you that was probably where I thought to say, well, how can I now take all of this body of work and learning and experience and then elevate it to a way that could be hopefully impactful in our community? So I don't know if I said I would like to be the director one day. I know that I kept looking. I want to get to the next level. I want to get to the next level. And how do I do that?
Yeah, and I know for you, as long as I've known you, it's all about the impact you make. But it is interesting, and one of my observations when I first met you, because for context, this family fund, which is the reason I originally met you, you're very open to this idea that we collaborated on, kind of fulfilling needs, maybe summer camp, transportation, enrichment activities for foster kids, which at the time wasn't necessarily directly covered by the agency. And so we kind of collaborate on that. What struck me immediately is that you're open, very open to new ideas. And I'm sure you had 100 people a day trying to give you ideas, and you were able to sift through the ideas and collaborate with people. But, and I think when, I think about your leadership in general, but specifically about job and family services, you're able to think outside the box, which is sometimes hard to do in an agency like that. And you were always embracing that. And I'm wondering if your early experiences, being a frontline worker, kind of shaped you to find the flexibility in the system and how you actually went about doing that.
Actually, I think that's probably that. Yes, I think really have to become. I mean, really, families are incredibly resourceful. I mean, I would say to people, families figure things out and they know how to work the system, and I mean that in the best way possible. But they know how to maximize opportunities, and they're very creative. So I would say yes, but I think um, I realized, fortunately, early on that it takes a lot of people coming together to really make things happen, and none of us can do it alone. And I've been lucky to surround myself with great people like you who are brilliant, who are smart, who can see things that I can't see. Because I think that's a part of it is being around people that can push you and make you better, and that have the interest to join in that whatever that project or idea is. So um, I like to think of myself as a collaborator. I think that's really important for community. It's important that we, come together to solve these complex issues. Um, and what I so appreciate about when I got to meet you is, there weren't many people like you wanting to come into government to say, how do I help fix this? What do I do? Because not always, some people don't feel like they sort of feel like government should figure it out themselves. And from my experience, it's both. It's government, it's business, it's civic leadership, it's nonprofits, like everybody coming together to work on behalf of community.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and you've made me better in terms of my perspective on community. And now that I'm fortunate enough to be on the board of United Way Greater Cincinnati, I see those constituencies, those stakeholders coming together in a pretty unique way. So let's segue to talking about United Way of Greater Cincinnati, because it is pretty compelling what you're doing, and I know you're too humble to say this, but I think it's a template and a model that a lot of other types of organizations can use. But let's talk about it, because I remember running into you at the airport late 2019, early 2020. You had made the decision. I think at that point it was a couple months before you formally started. And of course, early 2020, January 2020 was before COVID was in anybody's mind. So you took the opportunity. First of all, was it a difficult decision? Was it a natural progression to kind of move on from job and family services to United Way? It seems like, based on what you described before, it was somewhat of a natural progression for you.
So it's both and, right? So it was I started to realize I loved my role at JFS, and will forever be grateful. But I started to kind of challenge myself. I would say in 2017, like, are we really solving the challenges? Because I started to see the children of families that I had worked with who now they're becoming youth and or early, like eight, and their conditions hadn't changed. Like they were living the same life as their parents. I'm like, we haven't done them any, like we have not solved this issue, and they're still in the system. So I started to kind of think about what can we do to not only meet a need today, but really get ahead of these challenges for families so we can really talk about changing conditions. So I would say I actually said to myself a couple of times, Am I part of the problem? Is the system part of the problem? I didn't really know the answer. So then when I was approached about the United Way, I will like to say it took a little bit of me being willing to let go of what I had, because I also knew, when you leave a role, things can change. So some of the things that I was really proud of that we might have started may not continue to exist, and that made me worried. But I also have to have humility, and life goes on no matter what, like who you are and where you go. So,
Right.
um, I think when I came to the decision, and it was a 6 month process, I it hit me, and I was like, I'm ready, because I really wanted to think about how can we really think about meeting needs today, but also disrupting the ecosystem that's holding families back. So, and then I started on March, as you know, March 16th, 2020, and then this thing happened and nobody knew what it would be, and then COVID. And so I will say, I mean, I think you even told me this. There's what is it? There's never like there's never a take advantage, like not take advantage, but we had a crisis happening. Use this time now to really start do something about the business. So it gave me the perfect opportunity to sort of turn things upside down in a positive way for families, and then really think about disrupting not only our system and how we engage community, but then how do we engage our partners.
Yeah, and you were humble enough to ask, "Am I part of the problem?" The answer is definitely not, but that you're asking that question and looking to be a disruptor, I think is in the most positive way. I mean, there's a lot of words and disruptor, changing the paradigm, whatever phrasing you want to use, it's really important. But for additional context, so United Way Greater Cincinnati, which is a very strong United Way in that entire movement historically, had gone through a fair bit of transition, a short-lived CEO, then an interim CEO. So there was already some transition and work, wood to chop, as they say, around that. Then you add, the COVID piece, which in terms of fighting economic inequality and all the issues in the community exacerbates many different issues. On top of that, I will note, I want to talk about women in leadership a little bit later, but you are the first woman to lead the United Way of Greater Cincinnati, which in itself is a fantastic accomplishment. But you put all that together, it's quite an experience to be starting day one. I also remember that you went on vacation right before you were starting, and then you came back early, if I remember correctly, because you couldn't wait to get started, and you saw the urgency of everything going on. But that must have been quite an experience the first handful of weeks on the job, getting your bearings, but also dealing with the early days of COVID as well.
No,
I
well, I
mean,
mean, so
I
you're right.
can't imagine what you went through.
Well, like you had a business, everybody, so you're right. I mean, I actually was, thinking I'm going to go on vacation. I'm going to like chill for the first time in my life. I've never not had a job, but and then
Mhm.
I realized, like, when things were happening, that our families in our community are going to be hit the hardest. Like when they started talking about shutting down businesses, who's going to get hurt the most are those that are in the service industry, childcare industry. Like they can't work from home. Like that's not even possible. School shut down. I mean, it was so. I actually called the board chair of the United Way, and she said afterwards she thought I was calling to say I wasn't going to take the job, and I'm like, I think I need to start a week earlier because the community is going to be in crisis. So the odd thing about the job initially was I met the staff, and then the next day we had sent most of the staff home, and then you're trying to navigate. But I am super lucky because I have a great team, and we all just became really focused on immediate needs of community and how can we be there, and how can we also make sure that we take away any rigor with getting money out the door to those that needed it. And so giving unrestricted dollars became a priority. Fortunately, because of my experience in my prior role, we were tapped by the federal government and the state to through our 211s, to our, like, it's called a hotline, to deliver immediate emergency assistance, financial, for housing and food. So we leaned into all the opportunities in the community to, number one, meet those immediate needs. And we also knew that we had to really think about and learn and look at the data because, just from my experience, we knew whatever the next year or two was going to be, families were going to be worse off. So how do we now prepare for what that looks like? And how do we think about delivering services or, how do we construct these systems to meet that need then? And certainly we have found that families are worse off today. In fact, I just think you heard me talk about the statistic at the last board meeting. We know that 50% of the children in this country, and I will say in our region, are living in households where the families are unable to meet the basic needs, which is food, housing, transportation, access to the internet, which became a basic need.
Yeah, it's staggering. I heard a story recently about certain schools, and this happens, I think, across communities where they send kids home with food over a weekend, a packed meal or whatever, because they're afraid they won't eat over a weekend. And to think of that happening, it speaks to your point about fighting poverty and promoting economic well-being. It's staggering, and people can be blissfully unaware, but the reality is it's happening right under our nose. And with that in mind, because COVID, as we talked about, exacerbated that issue, but it's always been an issue. And is the whole idea of promoting economic well-being? How did that take shape and develop in the early part of your tenure? And obviously, it evolved with COVID, but was that from day one kind of the focus and the idea? Because we all, United Way is a brand that everybody knows, but what I think is so interesting and impactful about what you're doing in Cincinnati is that I think even now the perception of United Way has evolved in terms of being a change agent and really promoting economic well-being in a very different way than maybe United Way has been viewed historically as just being a development umbrella. And I think it's really compelling. And I'm just curious when that really took shape.
Well, so I will tell you, when I was approached about the role, I questioned, like, I didn't in a I'm just out of curiosity, like, I'm sort of curious, like, you've raised all this wonderful these all these dollars, but I, as a practitioner, I'm not seeing, like, what's the impact. So I said, let's be an impact organization, and we raise money against the impact. So what does that mean? That means, like, let's identify the areas that, in the board, of course, you're on the board, that you had to agree to it. So we went through this really pretty rigorous strategic planning process about, and I know from my work in public sector work with families that housing, education, and financial stability and mobility is really what helps people change the conditions, not only today, but for the future. So we also had to say to ourselves, we have to get laser focused on those three things and nothing else if we really want to be serious. So we looked at the data. Sorry, we looked at the data. We looked at the region, and we really thought about what are the indicators within each one of those segments. And from working with families for so
Yeah.
long, it's about, most families really desperately want to do the best for their family. They just need help. So if it's like they've had an incident that set them back, let's help them get on their feet, but then continue to help them increase their income. And so what does that look like? So that's really how we changed our focus. So we became, what I would like to say is, we're an impact organization, number one, and we raise dollars against the pillars that we think are driving impact. And we say to the community, um, we will be accountable to that. So we are telling you, this is our goal. This is what we intend to do. You have to hold us accountable to that to see if we're doing it.
That accountability is key. But when I think about that, and it's not to suggest, I mean, United Way has been doing great work for decades and decades and really making positive change happen. That being said, when you make changes to the way that United Way or any organization has done things for a long time, there are a lot of entrenched constituencies that may not like the change, and may need to uh, get more information, need to be educated about why this change is going on. How do you, in whatever way you care to talk about it, how do you effectively navigate that education process? And not everybody's going to love the change no matter what you do. How do you effectively navigate that for the good of the organization? I could also make a side comment. It's incredibly stressful to do that too. Um, so how do when you think about how you navigate a situation like that, again, with the backdrop of COVID and everything else going on, it's a lot. And just curious if any lessons learned, because that's quite an experience to work through.
Yeah, I think a lot of it for me was just full transparency. Like, this is, this is where we are. It's I would say to people, thank you for being, with us for all these years. And we are becoming we're getting a little bit more intentional in our work, and this is our focus. And I hope that you'll continue to stay with us in this journey and be committed to it. But I also understand if it's not aligning with you. So I never wanted anybody to feel that they couldn't opt out. I wanted them to feel like they could opt out. I was hoping that they still kept in. I mean, if you think about that, I like to talk a lot about that collective ownership as a community, as like no matter where I sit, I should be part of the solution, and how can I help families wherever I am. Not everybody wants to do that, which is okay. So I feel so I felt like being very transparent, articulating it several different times, several different ways, like, change is coming, things are evolving, we're going through this process. Great work's been happening for many, many years, but I said a lot of times with business leaders, you had to probably change your business a lot the last few years to stay in business through COVID. I mean, most people I talk to had to do something different, whether you're in education, you're in business, even faith-based organizations had to change how they engage their congregation. So I kept saying, like, we're just like ever that. And we had to really think about how we show up and what does that look like. Um, so I feel like you probably can always, there's no, uh, in retrospect, I felt like we did a good job communicating and being transparent, but when I hear things sometimes like, oh, maybe we didn't do as good as a job. So it's like making sure that you are hitting all the avenues that you should. And also recognizing that everybody's appetite for change is different. Everybody's
Mm-hmm.
urgency for change is different. And there are some people that move more quickly than other people. And it's how do you uh, bring all those folks along in their different timing. But I
Yeah.
will say overall, and as a board member, you might have a different perspective, but I would say overall, I really thought we'd get a lot more pushback than we did. And most people were like, yeah, that makes sense. They were like, I understand that. And they they recognized that I feel like we were operating like a business.
Yeah. Well, I think, it's interesting being a board member and watching you and your senior team operate because, again, you're right. Everybody interprets information differently, and the communication styles of different people may not interpret things in the same way. But I will say, to your point earlier about being data driven and also receptive to hearing other ideas is really important because nobody gets it all right day one. And I think what you've done is provided people, not just board members, but different constituencies, whether it be agencies or people in the community or your broader staff, information and data to work with. And as you said, and I know I think through this a lot too, this cliche of right people, right seats, whether it's, your internal team, external stakeholders, whatever. It's very difficult to get that balance right. And for some people it's a good fit, for some people it's not, but it's dynamic, I guess is what's always going to be true. And as long as you're transparent to the extent possible and communicate and have data to support it, I think that's what's made it, my observation as a board member is that's what's made it successful is the data driven nature of what you're doing to explain why the change is necessary. So I for what that's worth, and I think it speaks. You talk about being a community catalyst. I think that's what makes it work. I'd be curious to hear directly from you and your words what being a community catalyst means, but it seems to me it's consistent with what you've already been talking about in making something happen.
Yeah, I was just thinking about something before I answer that question. I think um, I always so to answer your question, I had like there were we saw a fair amount of turnover in that first year because we weren't the same organization, and I thought that was fine. So a lot of discussions were, this is what the role is now. Is this the right role? Is it, like, are you on the right seat in the bus?
Hmm.
Or can we find you another seat? Or maybe this organization isn't the same organization that it was that you came to, which is fine.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
we talked a lot about, we were positioned, as you know, we had to first stabilize our revenue. And then what's the growth strategy? Like, how are we going to grow? And do we have the right talent to grow us, to get us there? Or how do we get that talent? And I I always say we are a nonprofit is a tax status. It's not, it doesn't mean we work differently. We don't have the same responsibilities. We don't have the same work ethic. So I think some people come and they think, oh, it's a nonprofit. I don't have to work. I'm like, no, no, no. This is work. This is rigor. This is accountability. And sometimes some business leaders will, I mean, they'll say to me, well, if you were really that good, you'd be in the business world. Well, I think I am running a business. And so therefore I'm in a nonprofit because the tax codes say I have to be, but that doesn't mean that we're not operating and there isn't rigor and expectancy. Now, the wonderful thing about it is that we also have a component of our work that is deep in community. And that's of course, that's dear to my heart, but it's got to be both if you're going to be successful. So, as you hear me say a lot, like we center community voice, number one, and we look at data. We test solutions, we test things, we scale it if it works. If we realize our theory isn't right, we change it or we trash it and try something different. So we have to be able to have the curiosity to innovate and change, also recognize when something's not working and be courageous to say, maybe it worked at one time, it doesn't anymore, or then be courageous to scale it and say, how do we scale it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, as validation of what you're talking about, let's talk a little bit about that MacKenzie Scott grant, which was a nice positive to get a $25 million grant. First of all, I mean, everything you're saying really resonates, and you do run it as a top business mentality, which is gratifying because the impact on the community is really strong. And I think MacKenzie Scott, through her team, saw that as well. Tell us a little bit about how you found out about the grant. It's a good story. Yeah, I'd love to hear that first, and then we can talk about the impact of that grant.
Yeah, so I received a couple of emails in I think November. It was early November, and I didn't know what it was, and I took it to my IT department. They're like, "Oh, that's phishing. Delete it. Do what you have to do." So I did that, and then I got a call from somebody I didn't know, and they said, "Have you received these two emails?" I'm like, "This is weird." They're like, "I need you to call this. I'm going to give you a number, and I need you to call this person." So I'm like, "Okay." So I call this person, and it ends up that she starts talking to me and she's like, well, we have some news I wanted to share. And it was right before Thanksgiving, the day before Thanksgiving, I'm driving and she's talking about this donor that wants to give us some money. And so I'm like, oh, that's great. But she wanted to stay anonymous and we had to sign paperwork that said we would keep her anonymous until she was ready to say who she was. Any event, we go on. And then she says she could tell me who it is. But I had to keep it quiet. So she says MacKenzie Scott. Well, I'm embarrassed that I didn't know who that was then. But if you think about way back then, she wasn't as well known as she is today. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm not. No, she first of all said she's an author and a philanthropist, and then told me her name. And then I said, gosh, what books has she written? I'll try to figure out if I can find out who she is. So it was we giggled about that. And then she says, so she wants to give you $25 million by the end of the year. Well, I was driving and I was like, excuse me? And unrestricted. The only thing that she wanted to make sure this donor was that she knew a lot about my career and the things that I had done and what we were doing at United Way. And she wanted to make sure that we continue to work on system change type of work to really think about transformational change. So long story short, we eventually could tell everybody who it was, and she gave us $25 million unrestricted through a donor advised fund. You can imagine that.
Such a great story. Especially your IT department, they were doing the right thing to protect you, but it was a phishing email, but turned out to be a $25 million grant and has a big impact on the community. So I hear a lot about the MacKenzie Scott dollars and everything else. Talk a little bit about how that's impacting what you've been doing.
Yeah, I mean, it couldn't have come at a better time. So number one, we immediately put it in an investment account because we wanted to make sure that we were we were growing it where we could. But if you recall in the beginning, I knew that we had to do certain things now. So we continue with our methodology and how are we meeting the current needs. So we put $5 million immediately back into community, helping families stabilize, making sure they had housing, food, etc. We also took a very patient approach with the board, and the board supported it. And we kept saying, we know that in 2, 3, 4 years, we'll have a better we'll have better knowledge about what's happened in our community. And then we will use these dollars to really talk about the transformation that needs to occur post COVID. Now, we didn't think it was going to last as long as it did, but we were patient. And so what I'm super excited about, I'm not excited about the conditions in community because we've seen children take a huge setback in loss of learning, and absenteeism rates are really high. And we know that our families have never, are still struggling immensely about their economic well-being. And housing is a huge issue in our region as it is across the country. Evictions at an all-time high. We have used we are now using the remaining dollars, and we're investing in initiatives that are really driving change in conditions, not only today, but for future generations. So we, as a board member, this, we announced a 3-year plan where we really focused in on driving change through the people side of housing, like stabilizing evictions, making sure families have rights to counsel. How do we keep people in their homes? Because home repairs are expensive. The taxes have gone up. How do we help them afford that? But also think about transfer of wealth. A house, transferring your home to your children is the greatest way to transfer wealth. But so many families that are under-resourced have tangled titles. So we're helping them do those things. We're testing different things across that are working in other parts of the country to really think about housing. So we're using that, as well as in education. How do we have the supports for families and children place-based? So no matter what school you go to, whether it's public, charter, parochial, if you need help with tutoring or you need help with transportation, is housing the challenge? We want to make sure kids are stable in their neighborhood so they can go to school, parents can go to work, and they can go to school not worried about being hungry, not worried about where they're going to sleep tonight, but having that stability. So doing a lot of different educational supports, initiatives, and testing different things. And then lastly, just thinking about how do we continue to give youth the opportunity, and adults, how do I improve my financial situation now? So do I want to increase my training certificates if I'm a youth? How do I get you some internships when you're in high school, whether it's an apprenticeship, to think about, do I go to college or go into the trades or go into manufacturing? So really thinking about how we build out our youth opportunities so that they stay in school, they graduate, and they have hope for the future in terms of what their financial abilities are. So that's where we're really focusing those dollars in. And we're doing some kind of neat things. We're testing some things that have happened in other parts of the country about savings accounts for youth for college. Some interesting landlord tenant partnerships where we're preventing an eviction, and landlords are actually investing in the prevention work because it saves them money long term. So just kind of some innovative projects, and then we'll continue to see what works and then scale it.
which is phenomenal, and it speaks to the innovative work that the United Way of Greater Cincinnati is doing. And it's interesting. I was reading recently from a prior board packet talking about kindergarten readiness and chronic school absenteeism. I mean, for example, I've seen it. I think this came from you, that as high as 2/3 in certain schools of chronic absenteeism, so 66%, and post COVID, a big drop in kindergarten readiness. So I think that your point about education is a point really well taken. It's critical from the get go to change that course. And it's interesting. It makes me think also, and you'll frame it more artfully than I can, but it also talks about how, when you came on board, there was a paradigm shift in the works to change the thought around stakeholders. For example, in terms of service delivery, opening up the mentality around what a United Way agency, quote unquote, is, or who's delivering innovative types of programs. For example, grassroots or community organizations, faith-based organizations, things like that, which was a paradigm shift. And I'm just curious how that's worked in terms of accomplishing and reaching the goals that you'd kind of set out from the beginning, in terms of changing those stakeholders.
Yeah, no, I mean, just from my work in my prior role, I just knew that community, community looks different in every neighborhood, right? Every zip code. And that what I
Right.
had seen at the United Way from my perspective and from feedback from community was some of the organizations that we had invested in historically didn't represent community, meaning they don't look like me, or I don't feel comfortable going to them. And sometimes I say, like, the well-branded organizations just don't work in some neighborhoods. Like, and I don't want to go over there across town. I wanted to have, so we've been really intentional about making sure that the organizations that we're not only investing in with financial resources, but we're partnering are really truly representative community. Uh, they are geographically placed, so we feel like we have. If we see gaps in services or needs, we try to fill those gaps. Like, who can come in and to fill this gap? Because we look at data all the time. And just like you or I, we want to choose. Like, if I go to the doctor, I want to choose. Hopefully, I get to choose who my doctor is. We want families to be able to choose who they want to work with, and then we want to support them on that journey. And quite frankly, like a non-traditional, small, not-for-profit, they might not have a grant writer full time, so they don't know how to write a grant. Whereas if I'm a well-branded organization, I probably have 3 grant writers that know how to do it. So we actually support a lot of non-traditional with backbone support, so that they can be competitive and they can get grants, which then helps them get more grants. So it's really building an equity across the board. And some of these really small 1 or 2 person organizations are doing really good work. And so how do we scale that? How do we bring that forward? And then again, it benefits community if they have those options.
It really sets the trend for the community with a mentality like that. I have one more question to ask you about United Way, and it relates to the 211 call center, which I know was critical during COVID for direct help and referral services. But I'm curious how that's evolved too. I know there's a lot of potential for public-private partnership with the 211 call center. I know it makes an impact every day. How has that kind of evolved, and where do you see it going? I mean, it makes such an impact now. Is it where you want it to be? Are there next stages of how that impacts the community?
So no, great question. So 211, I will tell you, when I was at JFS, my other role, if I had known about 211, I would have been like, okay, that's let's use 211. So I like to think of we have invested we've invested MacKenzie Scott money in 211 right now. And we intend to do more of that. So for those of you that don't know, 211 is like the social services equal to 911 for emergencies, or 988 for mental health crisis. So we are working really closely with those 3 systems. We're a national number. 211's a national number. We cover, it's part of a national network. 95% of the United States is covered by that. And we really are trying to say, like, if somebody calls the police and it's a social service need, the police will flip them to 211 or vice versa. So we're really trying to make sure we're not flooding the wrong system with the calls. What I love about 211 and what we've been trying to do is dear to my heart is keeping families out of the public sector system, particularly in child welfare, if they have no business being there. They just have a crisis. There's not concerns about abuse or neglect. They're doing everything they can do. They just need help with X, Y, or Z, whatever it is. And how do we give them those services? So 211 initially was what I would like to say the traditional information referral. This is pre-COVID. When I was here and I kind of like found it, I'm like, oh my gosh, we have to magnify it, and we became really the one true source of data and a center for people to call. If you think of people that didn't have the internet, they were calling us saying, help me find services. So we've also now have built in a closed loop referral. So we're making sure we're connecting people to services, and then we're following up with them to know if they got them that. But better yet, we just purchased a platform from LA where we are curating all this data. So we have all of these organizations, services, providers in our database, so anybody can access it. And when a family calls, because everybody has more than one thing happening, like all of us, we were able to say, well, here's a list of places for food, housing, medical. We can connect them. We can give them information about wait, if they have wait lists or not. And then the providers love it, because we're not referring people to places that have such a long provider line that they can't help them. So more to come on that. Eventually, we're now talking to healthcare systems about how we can, like so many people we know in Children's Hospital, that one of the highest reentries in the ER is dental, which is connected to food insecurity. So how are we connecting when families are there, like to make sure that they have the needs when their children and families are leaving? Same thing with like Christ Hospital says one of the biggest barriers for them that they see reentry was with transportation. So if somebody's leaving their own transportation, let's figure out what's going on. So really trying to make that connection to help hospitals so that we can keep their costs down for emergency rooms, but also how we're helping families navigate systems within their community. And then the last part will be what I love about it is with all the data, we can also see gaps in services or gaps in needs. Um, so how are we coming together as a community to fill that need? Or like, let's say you have 5 pantries here and you have one here. Well, let's figure that out so that it's more equitable. So I'm excited about it. I think there's lots of things. And I love, to your point, the public-private partnerships, I think is how we maximize opportunities for our community.
Yeah, 211 was a revelation to me in terms of what it can do, and I'm really excited about where that goes. It does speak, I think United Way Greater Cincinnati, and you specifically talk about bold actions to elevate impact. I think that's a perfect way to summarize, you know, where this journey has taken you over the last handful of years. It's now 4.5, almost 5 years. Time flies when you're having fun, I suppose. I know you've been working very hard, but that's exciting. One other question that just struck me when we were talking about public-private partnerships is so much of building impact is about community corporate partnerships with different corporations, and United Way is uniquely situated in that regard. And I know that that's also part of the board impact as well. But talk to me just briefly a little bit about how the prominent companies and smaller companies in Cincinnati kind of step up to have an impact on the community, because I think United Way is uniquely situated in viewing that happen and what role they play.
I mean, we couldn't do this work without them, really, honestly, because they're key in helping us. I mean, they give us access to their employee base, and I say that not just because we want. I mean, we of course we love their money, but it's really education. Like so many people don't know necessarily what's happening in their community, and from my experience, once people know and they can touch it, they can feel it, they can volunteer in it, they become more engaged. So it's how are we doing, that whether it's corporate social responsibility or whatever you want to call it, like most companies will say that they have a workforce that really wants to feel like they're doing something good for mankind in some level. So we get to meet with companies and say, what's interesting to your employees? Like, what do they want to work on? And we could kind of curate an opportunity for them to have volunteer activities and then hopefully eventually get really engaged. So, but the business and community is a critical, I mean, one of the most critical components almost of the work because I get lucky because I have brilliant people like you sitting around the table who are running companies, helping give ideas, thinking things through. We have the opportunity to access some of the support systems and services that they have. So it just elevates our ability to provide the best possible services or opportunities for families in our region.
Phenomenal. I have one more question for you, and it's kind of an open-ended question about women in leadership. From the beginning of your career, and obviously you've had a lot of success, and we keep using the word impact, but it's true. It applies directly to what you've accomplished in your career. But I'm curious what you think about the role of a woman leading an organization, how it's changed perception-wise. You're the first female leader of United Way of Greater Cincinnati. You've been the first in a lot of different ways, doing a lot of different things. How has that challenged you throughout your career? Do you think, the perception of women leading companies, entities has changed? I know there's always work to do in terms of gender equality and the way people view things, but I'd be curious, very open-ended question, but curious what your perspective is on women leading organizations more generally these days.
Yeah, I mean, I think yes, it's we do better. I mean, I think, but we can always do better. So, I think that early on, I never really tried to think much about it because um, I don't. That's a really good question to myself. Why didn't I just like kept saying, "Put your head down, do a good job." Interestingly enough, in the job that I held before, I was surrounded by mostly men, which I think was kind of interesting. That they were my equal parts were more men in that role than women. Um, so I think that I've always tried not to. I've always tried to think of it as it's not a big deal. Like, so here I am, and just put your head down, do a good job. There have been times where things have been said to me that I'm like, you probably wouldn't say that to a guy, or you would, am I sometimes held to a different standard? I mean, and maybe that's my own baggage. I don't know, but I feel like when women are courageous and they make tough decisions, they don't always get held up in the same way that a man who does it, like, oh, he's a strong leader, he's doing great stuff. Whereas sometimes women are not, they don't say those things about women. But I also am hopeful that things are continuing to change and evolve. And I've been lucky because I worked with both men and women in leadership roles that have been awesome, who have taught me a lot. And that's, I'm always interested to learn and always interested to learn from a colleague or anybody, like how I could do better. So,
Well said. And your leadership is clear. You've done incredible things, not only at United Way of Greater Cincinnati, but before that at Job and Family Services. And it's a real privilege to know you and be your friend and have learned from you. I love your family as well. Steve and Colin are great people, and I'm looking forward to collaborating with you for many years to come. So hopefully you won't mind me hanging around and learning from you some more. But thank you for all you do for the community. And again, I think that the things you're doing are a template for a lot of other communities as well. So thrilled, Moira, to have had you on the Super Performers podcast. Thanks so much for the time, and look forward to seeing what lies ahead for you.
well, thank you. And you've been an awesome friend. And I'm lucky to have you for all these years supporting me. So thank you.
Absolutely. Good things to come.
Thank you.
Thanks, Moira. I learned a lot from having Moira Weir as my guest on the Super Performers podcast, and it reminded me of how much vision she has in creating positive change. I enjoyed hearing about her roots in Philadelphia with parents that embrace the concept of community. In the early part of her career, it was interesting hearing about her transition from the for-profit to the not-for-profit world, starting with her volunteer work with a foster child and finding a calling in the work at Job and Family Services. It was also compelling hearing her thoughts around running a not-for-profit, noting that it is just a tax status and should be managed as any successful business with transparency, the right team, and data-driven informed decision-making. The stories about how United Way of Greater Cincinnati has changed the paradigm with a focus on reducing economic inequality and creating more optimal service delivery in that regard were really notable. We heard about new education initiatives, the 211 social service hotline, and also evolving to serve more individuals through an evolving stakeholder paradigm. It's not surprising that MacKenzie Scott granted $25 million unrestricted dollars to United Way of Greater Cincinnati, broadening the impact of Moira's and the organization's work. The story of how Moira found out about the grant was really fun to hear. Moira is an innovator and a leader. I'm grateful for her continued impact and really enjoyed the episode. Thanks again for joining us on the Super Performers podcast today, powered by 4100 FS. I hope you not only enjoyed listening, but you found the insights thought-provoking and relevant. We'll be back soon with another episode of Super Performers, Insights from the Driven. This is Rob Herman. Bye for now.